In the heart of an ancient kingdom, where golden sunrises crowned silent temples and the rivers moved like silk through the land, there lived a king praised for his strength, but not always for his insight. Among his court was a minister known, not for his titles or trophies, but for the quiet clarity in his eyes. He did not rush to speak, but when he did, even the birds seemed to hush. The king sought his counsel on all things great and small. But where light gathers, shadows grow, and envy took root in the hearts of others who wore silk and smiles. One morning, the king, veiled in amusement, said to the minister, "You are wise, but your son is the opposite. Each day I offer him a test. I place before him 2 coins, 1 gold, 1 silver, and ask him which is more valuable. And each day he chooses silver. Tell me, what kind of wisdom is that?" The court erupted in laughter, loud and cruel, as if they had finally found a crack in the marble. The minister said nothing. But that evening, beneath the hush of incense and the flicker of oil lamps, he turned to his son, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity. "My son," he asked, "you know that gold is more valuable than silver. So why, when the king offers you both, do you always choose the silver?" The boy looked up, and for a moment, his silence spoke more than words. The boy, still calm, opened his hands as if offering a secret that could only be given in stillness. "Father," he said gently, "each morning, the king walks among the people with eyes that pretend to see and a voice that enjoys the sound of riddles. When he sees me, he smiles and holds out 2 coins, 1 silver, 1 gold, and asks, 'Which is more valuable?' And I answer, 'Silver,' and take it. Then he laughs, as do the others, and walks away pleased." The minister listened, his brow furrowed not with anger but reflection. "But why?" he asked softly. "You know the truth. Why give the wrong answer every time?" The boy rose and led his father to a quiet room at the back of the house. There, he lifted the lid of an old wooden box. Inside lay rows upon rows of silver coins, hundreds of them, each one shining with the same modest glow. "These are the coins I've taken," the boy said. "Each day the king asks, I answer as he expects. Not because I am ignorant, but because I know should I ever say gold and take the golden coin, the game will end. He will stop asking. The moment will disappear." The minister stood in silence, staring at the pile of silver that had come not from ignorance, but from insight. In that moment, he did not see a fool. He saw someone who understood the king better than the king understood himself. The minister sat beside the open box, his fingers brushing against the cold edges of the silver coins. They were small, unassuming, each one insignificant on its own. But gathered like this, they spoke of time, repetition, and quiet awareness. They spoke of a boy who listened deeper than most adults ever had. For a moment, he thought of the laughter in the court, the way voices had collided in amusement at his son's expense. And yet, none of those voices had paused long enough to see the larger truth hidden behind the boy's daily ritual. He turned to his son. "Do you not feel mocked, belittled, misunderstood?" The boy smiled. "Father, to be misunderstood by those who rush to judge is not a burden. The king finds joy in asking. I find peace in not resisting. And the silver? It teaches me patience." Outside, a breeze stirred the prayer flags hanging from the eaves. The air smelled of jasmine and old wood. The minister, long admired for his wisdom, now felt himself learning something anew. Not from scriptures or debates, but from the quiet mind of his own son. What is wisdom? He wondered, if not the ability to see the whole when others are distracted by the part? What is foolishness, if not the inability to listen past appearances? He looked again at the silver coins, not as currency, but as a mirror. And in them, he saw not a boy pretending to be a fool, but a teacher wearing the mask of simplicity. The following morning, the minister stood beside a window, watching the pale sun rise over the rooftops of the capital. Bells rang faintly from a distant temple, like whispers drifting across the earth. He thought of the king, powerful, revered, but still bound by the games he played. And he thought of his son, unassuming, quiet, yet free in a way few could understand. Later that day, he returned to the court. As expected, the king greeted him with a smirk, and the room tensed with expectation. The minister bowed with calm dignity, his silence heavier than any defense. "Has your son learned the difference between silver and gold yet?" the king asked, his voice amused, almost teasing. The minister smiled, but not in mockery. "My lord," he said with measured grace, "he knows it better than most. Perhaps even better than I." There was a pause, brief but sharp, like a bell cutting through fog. The king's brow lifted. For the first time, he seemed unsure whether he had been praised or corrected. Around them, the court remained still, the usual laughter caught in their throats. The moment passed like a ripple on still water. That evening, the minister returned home and sat beside his son once more. "The world thinks in measures of wealth and noise," he said. "But you've taught me that silence has its own currency, and sometimes the wisest path is not to correct the world, but to quietly outgrow its illusions." The boy nodded, eyes steady as moonlight. That night, sleep did not come easily to the minister. Not because of worry, but because his mind was busy undoing old knots. There are truths that take root suddenly like lightning striking dry ground, and others that grow slowly like moss over stone, unnoticed until one morning you see green where you once saw gray. He rose before dawn and stepped outside. The sky was still dark, but the stars had begun to surrender to the coming light. The silence was deep, but not empty. It was alive, like a breath held by the universe. He watched as a single bird landed on the roof, tilted its head, and waited. Not singing, not searching, just present. That stillness reminded him of his son. There was a kind of wisdom that didn't argue, didn't seek applause. It moved through life like water, gentle, ungraspable, but always shaping what it touched. The minister sat in the courtyard, his robe gathering the cold of morning. He thought of the court, the king, the games of pride and perception. And he thought of how his son had managed to remain untouched by all of it, not by rebellion, but by quiet understanding. He whispered to the wind, to bend without breaking, to answer without needing to win. This is the strength no one teaches, because it cannot be taught. It must be lived. And in that stillness, as shadows faded into the birth of day, the minister felt himself being taught again, not by words, but by presence. The next morning, the boy rose before the sun and walked alone to the marketplace. He passed through narrow alleys where lanterns still flickered and incense clung to the stone. The city had not yet awakened, and in that quiet hour, the world felt ancient, like something sacred, waiting to be remembered. At the edge of the plaza, he found the king already there, dressed not in royal robes, but in the plain garments he wore when walking among the people. No guards, no crown, just a man standing before a boy, holding 2 coins in his palm, silver or gold. The king asked as always, his tone half curious, half playful. The boy bowed, his hands folded in front of him. "Silver, your majesty," he said gently, lifting the smaller coin with grace. The king chuckled, just as he always did. "Still the same answer?" The boy smiled. "Yes, still the same." People nearby laughed. Some shook their heads. A few whispered, "Foolish child." But the boy did not flinch. He bowed once more and turned away, walking with calm steps toward the rising sun. Each footfall was like a mantra, steady and unfazed. Behind him, the king watched with narrowed eyes, not in mockery, but in thought, for reasons he could not explain. The laughter around him felt thinner that day, as if the joke had begun to lose its weight. And in the boy's silence, the king heard something he hadn't noticed before, the sound of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. That evening, The king sat alone in his chamber, the silver coin still resting in his palm. It felt heavier than usual, not in weight, but in meaning. The fire crackled softly beside him, casting shadows that danced along the carved walls. His fingers traced the smooth edge of the coin over and over, as if hoping it would whisper its secret. He remembered the boy's eyes, not confused, not afraid, but calm. Not the gaze of a fool, but of someone who saw through things. What does he see that I do not? The king murmured to the silence. He had always thought of the game as harmless amusement, a test of cleverness to which the boy responded with predictable simplicity. But now, a quiet question had begun to stir in him. What if the boy had never misunderstood the riddle? What if he had understood it too well? In the quiet, the king began to recall other moments, voices in the court that had spoken too loudly. Praises given to those who shouted first. Truths overlooked because they came wrapped in humility. He closed his hand around the coin. Perhaps wisdom did not always shine like gold. Perhaps it sometimes shimmered like silver, softer, quieter, hidden in plain sight. The fire dimmed. The king leaned back and stared into the flames, not seeking answers, but letting the questions sit like stones at the bottom of a clear stream. Sometimes the wisest truths do not arrive with noise, but with a whisper. The next day, the minister found his son tending to a small garden behind their home. The boy's hands were covered in soil, and his attention was fixed on a sprout pushing through the earth. He touched it gently, as if greeting an old friend returning after a long journey. The minister watched from a distance before speaking. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "how long people will mistake your silence for ignorance?" The boy smiled without turning. "Perhaps they will, but the seed does not rush to prove itself to the stone." The minister approached and knelt beside him. "Still, don't you ever wish to correct them? To show them what you know?" The boy looked up, his eyes reflecting the open sky. Wisdom doesn't always need to be seen. If it feeds pride, it becomes performance. But if it stays hidden, it becomes strength. A butterfly landed on a nearby leaf, still as a prayer. A breeze passed, but it did not fly away. There is something powerful, the boy continued, about knowing something and choosing not to display it. The world is so loud, Father, but not everything needs to be spoken to be understood. The minister nodded slowly. Each word from his son was like water on parched earth, simple, but nourishing. In that garden, surrounded by silence, soil, and morning light, the minister felt a lesson more profound than any scroll could offer. For sometimes, understanding is not about answering questions, but living in a way that dissolves them. The king, restless in thought, decided to walk the city without his usual escort. He moved through narrow streets where incense curled from open windows, where children laughed freely and merchants prepared their stalls in silence. It was early. The sky still brushed with blue-gray light, and the world had not yet covered itself in noise and expectation. He passed the boy's home, unnoticed, and paused near the garden wall. The sound of gentle voices drifted through the air, father and son, speaking not in debate, but in quiet reflection. It was the kind of conversation that did not demand to be heard, yet held more weight than the loudest proclamation shouted in. A hall of mirrors. The king turned away, a curious ache rising in his chest. He wandered until he reached the edge of the city, where a temple stood carved into the hillside, ancient and weathered like truth itself. A place he rarely visited, but today it called to him like a forgotten part of his own soul. An old monk greeted him at the gate with a bow so slow it felt like time itself was acknowledging the moment. No words passed between them. They walked together past prayer wheels and moss-covered stones, where silence was not absence, but presence. Finally, the monk spoke. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to reveal the nature of the one who asks. The king stood still, and sometimes, the monk said, the wisest know when to let the world misunderstand. The king remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground as if trying to read the meaning hidden beneath fallen leaves. The monk, with hands folded behind his back, walked ahead slowly, letting the king's silence stretch. Giving it space to breathe, they reached the temple's inner courtyard, where a stone basin caught rainwater from the tiled roof above. The surface of the water was still, perfectly still, reflecting the sky as if it were a doorway. The monk stopped beside it and looked in. "You see," he said softly, "truth is not always about being right. Sometimes it is about being rooted. Like this water, it doesn't chase reflections, it simply holds them." The king stepped closer, peering into the basin. He saw his own face, lined with years of decisions, pride, and pretense. But the reflection did not accuse him. It merely existed. "Your Majesty," the monk continued, "if a child offers you a simple answer again and again, do not ask why. He chooses it. Ask why you feel the need to correct him." The wind stirred, sending ripples through the water, breaking the reflection into fragments. For a moment, the king felt something inside him shift like a weight loosening its grip. Looked up at the monk. "And what if the answer isn't for me?" The monk smiled. "Then perhaps you are only a mirror in his path." And with that, the monk turned and walked away, disappearing into the garden of bells and shadows. That night, the king did not return to his chambers immediately. Instead, he sat alone in the palace gardens, where lanterns swayed gently in them. Breeze and the moon cast silver paths across the stone. The fragrance of night-blooming jasmine floated through the air like an old memory returning. He thought of the boy choosing silver, again and again, in the presence of gold. Not because he didn't know better, but because he knew something deeper. He thought of the minister, silent in the face of ridicule, and the monk, whose words lingered like incense long after they had faded from the air. The world, he realized, is full of people who chase gold. Gold in praise, in position, in approval. But perhaps silver, the quieter choice, held something more enduring, something the eye misses but the soul feels. He reached into his robe and pulled out the silver coin from that morning. He turned it in his fingers, slowly, reverently, as if it were a sacred relic dot in that small disk of metal. He now saw something hidden in plain sight. A lesson about restraint, about presence, about the strength of not needing to win. The boy had taught him not through defiance, but through patience. Through a quiet pattern that asked no one to understand. The king closed his hand around the coin. It felt different now. Not like something lesser than gold, but like something lighter. And sometimes, he thought, lightness is the truest form of power. The following morning, the king did not bring coins to the marketplace. He walked slowly through the streets, his hands empty, but his heart unusually full. The familiar sounds of vendors, footsteps, and idle talk echoed around him, yet they no longer tugged at his thoughts. He moved not as a ruler demanding attention, but as a man returning from a long inward journey. When he saw the boy standing quietly in his usual place, their eyes met. The boy bowed politely, without speaking. There was no coin today. No question. Just the stillness between them, wider than any riddle could hold. The king stopped before him. "Do you know," he asked gently, "why I stopped bringing the coins?" The boy looked up and smiled, not with pride, but with warmth and clarity. "Because the lesson was not in the gold, and not in the silver," the king nodded slowly, "and not in the answer either." The boy's silence was his agreement. In that silence, something shifted like a stone finally settling at the bottom of a river. They stood quietly, while the marketplace moved around them, unaware of the quiet unfolding. It was as though the moment had folded inward like a lotus, closing in evening light. Then the king said, "Thank you." The boy bowed again and turned to go, blending into the tapestry of the world. And though his figure vanished in the crowd, the echo of his lesson would remain unseen, but alive in the king's every step. That evening, the minister sat once more in the quiet of his home. A soft breeze moved through the open windows, carrying the scent of sandalwood and the distant sound of temple bells. He poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of the empty seat across from him. His son would return soon, but the minister didn't wait in impatience. He simply sat, allowing the moment to unfold as it wished without demand, without urgency. He had spent years advising kings, untangling matters of law and war, wealth and power. Yet the wisdom that had most deeply moved him had come not from scrolls or assemblies, but from the silent choices of a boy who needed no throne to rule his mind. When the boy entered, he bowed gently and took his seat. They drank tea in silence. For a while, watching the steam rise and disappear, like thoughts passing through a still mind, the minister finally spoke. "The king said nothing of you today," the boy smiled. Then perhaps he said more than ever. The minister returned the smile. "Do you ever wish they saw you differently?" The boy looked out the window, where the first star had begun to glow. "I only wish to see clearly. If others misunderstand, that is their journey, not mine." The minister nodded, understanding not just the words, but the space between them. Sometimes, the most radiant wisdom wears no title, claims no victory, and answers only to the quiet voice within. The next morning, the king sat beneath the Bodhi tree in the palace courtyard, a tree rarely noticed, though it had stood there longer than most men had lived. Its leaves whispered gently with the wind, as if reciting truths that only the still-hearted could hear. A servant approached to speak, but seeing the king's closed eyes and steady breath, he stepped back quietly. The king was not asleep. He was listening, not to the world, but to something deeper, something that had no words. He thought again of the boy, not as a figure of amusement, but as a reflection of something he had once known but forgotten: the strength of not needing to prove anything, the courage to be still while others rushed to be seen. He remembered his own childhood, when he too had once chosen quiet over applause, simplicity over spectacle. Somewhere along the way, the gold of the world had dazzled him into forgetting. Now, under the branches of the Bodhi tree, he remembered. He opened his eyes slowly and looked upward. The leaves shimmered in the morning sun like coins made of light, and for the first time in years, he felt no need to measure their worth. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom does not rise through conquest or command. It grows quietly, like a seed beneath soil, waiting patiently for someone to stop, to kneel, and to notice. And so, the king sat, doing nothing, and yet, in that stillness, everything began to move. Later that day, the minister and his son walked along a quiet forest path just beyond the city's edge. The trees arched above them like ancient guardians, their branches weaving sunlight and shadow into sacred patterns on the ground. Birds moved from limb to limb without fear, as if they, too, recognized the stillness carried by the 2 travelers. Neither spoke at first. The sound of footsteps on soft earth, the rustling of wind through leaves, and the distant hum of life were the only companions to their silence. The forest did not require speech. It asked only for presence, for attention without commentary. Finally, the minister asked, "Do you believe the king has changed?" The boy did not answer immediately. He bent to pick up a fallen leaf, holding it up to the light. Its veins glowed like rivers drawn across ancient parchment. "Perhaps," he said gently, "but change is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives, like this leaf, quiet, unnoticed, but no longer clinging to the branch. It lets go, not to fall, but to rest and become part of the earth." The minister smiled at the simplicity of the image. "And will you still meet him if he returns with the same question again?" The boy nodded. Yes, the question was never the problem. It was the space between the question and the answer where truth waited patiently. They continued walking. The path curved gently, revealing a clearing where a stream glistened, and time itself seemed to pause. The stream in the clearing moved slowly, its surface dappled with falling leaves and golden light. The boy stepped to its edge and crouched down, watching the water pass over stones smoothed by time. He dipped his fingers into the current, feeling the chill not as discomfort, but as a reminder of presence. The minister joined him, kneeling beside his son. "It seems," he said, "that water remembers what we often forget." The boy looked up. "What does it remember?" "That movement is not always noise. That softness is not weakness. That flowing away is not the same as losing." A leaf landed gently on the surface and drifted forward, unresisting. The stream did not push, nor did it cling. It simply carried what arrived and let go of what passed. For a while, they said nothing. The world around them breathed with quiet confidence, the kind that does not demand to be seen, but makes its presence known all the same. The light filtering through the trees shifted, and the shadows danced like old truths returning home. Then the boy said, "Father, one day the king may stop asking, and one day I may choose gold." The minister turned toward him, curious. "Why?" The boy answered, "Because when a lesson is fully learned, the form no longer matters. What remains is the essence." The minister smiled, deeply moved. In that single sentence, he heard the echo of every step, every silence, every silver coin, and the stream kept moving, toward nowhere, yet always arriving. Back in the palace, the king began to move differently. He still gave orders, signed decrees, and heard petitions, but something within him had softened. His words carried less urgency, more presence. He began to listen without the armor of authority. And when he spoke, his voice came not from the pride of a ruler, but from the awareness of a man who had finally tasted silence. One morning, while walking through the garden, he noticed a silver coin lying near the roots of a tree. It was old, slightly tarnished, but familiar in its quiet weight. He picked it up slowly and for a long moment simply held it in his palm. The boy had not returned for many days. The marketplace felt quieter without him, emptier in some ways, but also more spacious, like a riddle that had stopped demanding an answer. The king looked around at the garden, at the stillness of the stone paths, the soft rustle of wind through flowering branches. Then he placed the coin gently on the stone bench beside him and walked away, leaving it there like a folded page in a book he no longer needed to read aloud. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the king stood at his window and whispered, "Not every lesson is meant to be repeated forever." And though no one answered, he felt something respond within him, like a door that had always been open, but only now had he truly stepped through. Days passed like drifting clouds, and the boy did not return to the marketplace, but he was not missing, only elsewhere. In the garden behind his home, he began to spend more time in silence. He swept the earth with care, pruned branches with thoughtfulness, and sat beneath the shade of trees doing what others often forgot. Nothing at all. The minister watched him from afar, marveling at how stillness had become his son's language, and simplicity his strength. He no longer needed to ask him questions. The answers were already present, in the way he walked, in the way he breathed, in the way he listened without the need to speak. One afternoon, the boy placed the last of his silver coins into a small wooden box and tied it shut with a length of coarse string. Then he carried it to a nearby monastery at the foot of the mountain and left it on the steps, without a name or a note. A monk later found it and smiled, as if recognizing the offering not as a donation, but as a gesture of release. The boy did not look back. He returned home, where the wind moved through the bamboo like a soft hymn. There, he sat by the window and watched the light shift on the wall. He knew that the world would go on searching for answers, but he had found something gentler, something that asked nothing, yet gave everything. The joy of being quietly awake. The king, too, had begun to change, not in the eyes of his court, but in the quiet landscape of his own heart. He no longer sought the applause of his ministers, nor the constant approval of his people. He walked slower, breathed deeper, and found meaning in moments that once felt empty. One evening, he sat with the minister beneath a tree that overlooked the city. The horizon stretched out in silence, the last light of day sinking into the hills. They spoke little, but their silence was full like a cup that needs no filling. The king turned to him and asked, "Do you think he'll return to the court one day?" The minister smiled. He never truly left. He simply stepped beyond the noise into the rhythm only a quiet mind can hear. The king nodded, his eyes following the drifting clouds. There is a kind of wisdom that walks among us, hidden in plain sight. I used to think I was testing him, but now I see he was revealing me to myself. The wind stirred gently through the branches, and a bird called out from a distant tree. "Thank you," the king said, not only to the minister, but to all that had led him here. The boy's silence, the monk's gaze, the silver coin, and the absence of gold. The minister placed a hand over his heart and bowed. Sometimes, life does not send us the teachers we expect. It sends us the ones we need disguised as questions, missteps, or quiet children. In the stillness of the final morning, the boy walked alone through a field of golden grass. The wind moved gently, as if brushing past him with reverence. There were no crowds, no questions, no coins. Only sky above, earth below, and the breath between. He sat beneath a tree, not to meditate, not to seek, but simply to be. The silence around him was not empty, it was full of presence, of all that had been understood without words. Far away, the king stood at his window and closed his eyes. He imagined the boy beneath that tree, and in doing so, felt no distance between them. He breathed in slowly, and for the first time, the breath felt like a prayer at the monastery. A monk held the wooden box of silver coins and placed it on the altar without question. Offerings come in many forms, and this one had no inscription, only intention. And you, dear listener, perhaps you too have chased gold, longed to be understood, or measured wisdom in the wrong ways. But if there is stillness in you now, stay with it. Sit. Breathe. Let the world misunderstand you. If it must. Wisdom does not need to be loud. It needs to be lived. Quietly, patiently, truly. If this story has touched something in you, let it travel further. Share it. Practice it. Return to silence when you forget. And remember, the most valuable truths are not always the ones people applaud, but the ones that transform us in secret.